Before I had kids, I used to see those videos at church. I used to think they were so cheesy, like, this is so dumb, this is so corny. And now I'm like, they grow up so fast. It's different, man. Having kids makes you soft, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing. We're going to do a quick little game in honor of Father's Day, and you don't have to do anything. You just have to stand up. We're going to find out who has been a dad the longest in the room. So if you have been a dad for one day or more, I want you to stand up. Go ahead. And the winner, the person who stays standing at the end of this, is going to get a coffee gift card. So these are all of our dads who've been a dad for one day or more. Okay, stay standing if you've been a dad for 2 years or more. Okay, all right. 5 years or more. Still haven't lost him. Wow. Okay, 10 years or more. Okay, smaller. 15 years or more. Okay, 20 years. Fathers of 20 years. Wow, you guys have been dads for a long time. Okay, 30 years. If you've been a dad for 30 years or more. Okay, there's still a lot of you. 40 years. Who's been a father for 40 years or more? 45? 45, okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 50 years. Wow. Okay, my goodness. So we have 3 left. 55 years? Still? 2? Okay. Oh, wait. No. How old are your kids, Bill? So, okay, how's your oldest kid? My oldest kid? Yeah. 55. What about you? 55. Okay, it's a tie. Here's the problem. I only have 4 gift cards, but I'm going to give each of you a gift card, and then we'll figure out for next service, okay? That was a terrible throw. Watch your eyes. Oh, not quite. Well, thank you, guys. One last one for youngest dad, and this will be really quick. I want to find out who the most recent father is, because let's be real, you guys probably don't need the coffee as much as the most recent father. So who is the youngest father? Has anyone had a kid within the year? All right, we already did that. No, we didn't have anyone, huh? Within a couple years? Oh, it's Rusty, huh? Rusty had the most recent kid. Okay, Rusty, I've got a gift card for you. Here it comes. Oh. Well, congratulations, Dad. It's hard work, but it's good work. So we're going to continue our series in Psalms today. And we've covered, so Chase kicked this series off, and he did Psalm 1. And there's a number of different categories when it comes to the Psalms. How have we been doing on our reading? Are we keeping up? I think we're supposed to be on 75, chapter 75 today. And so who has done a good job of reading all the Psalms so far? Do we have anyone who's read wow, okay, we got some people who are in it. Good. Some of them can kind of seem repetitive, but there are different genres to the Psalms. Today we're going to be in Psalm 65, but I want to put up a picture here of the different categories. These are just some of the categories in the Psalms. So if you want to put that slide up, can we go to the next one? That's too small. Or that's what we got. Okay, so as you can clearly see on this chart, there's a number of different categories of Psalms. The first one that Chase covered was the wisdom Psalms. And so this is Psalm 1. And these are Psalms that emphasize the importance of seeking after wisdom, and they emphasize the benefit of gaining wisdom. These are very common Psalms. Psalm 1 is one of them. And then this chart that I'll probably email out. Oh, here we go. This you can read. So wisdom is one of the common ones. Lament is the most common one. 60% of the Psalms are what's called a lament psalm. And this is basically just the author pouring out his heart and saying, God, I'm upset, I'm sad, I need you to hear me. And they start off depressing, but what's really cool about the lament psalms is they all have this moment of hope in which their sadness turns to joy. We're going to be covering the lament psalms next week. Today, though, we're covering the psalms of praise. And so Psalm 65 is a psalm of praise. And this is also a really important genre of the Psalms because it teaches us how to worship. It teaches us how to respond to God in worship and in praise. So I want to turn to 65. We're going to be spending most of our time in Psalm 65 today, starting in verse 1. So if you would turn there with me, this is what it says. Praise awaits you, our God, in Zion. To you our vows will be fulfilled. You who answer prayer, to you all people will come. So really what a praise psalm is it's a call to worship. It acknowledges God as supreme, it acknowledges God as sovereign, and it calls us to respond in worship to our sovereign God. And so it paints this picture of what worship is. At the beginning of verse 1, it says, praise awaits you. It's this idea of praise from our lips, this verbal acknowledgement. It's kind of what we do when we sing. We're praising God with our mouth. But then it goes deeper than that. It kind of explains what worship is. It says, to you, our vows will be fulfilled. This idea that worship is not just something that happens with our mouth. We're not just praising Him with our words and singing. It's what we do with our actions. Right? Our vows will be fulfilled to you. This is dedication. Worship is not just something that happens with our lips. It's something that happens with our actions, with our heart, and with our soul. And then further in verse 2, it says, you who answer prayer, to you all people will come. We have this image of a God who is worthy of everything. When we worship God, we are called to take everything we have, our heart, our mind, our body, our soul, our strength, and we're to give Him all of it. Because God is worthy of all of it. We see this repeated all throughout the Old Testament, this idea that God is worthy of everything. And that God calls us to sacrifice everything in pursuit of worshiping Him. He calls this guy named Abraham at the beginning of Genesis. And He calls Abraham to follow Him. And He says, Abraham, I want you to leave your old life behind. Leave it all behind. You're going to follow me, and this is what it looks like to follow me, to give me everything. And as Abraham slowly figures out, when God says, I'm asking you to give me everything, He means it, because at one point He says, Abraham, I want you to give me your firstborn son, your only son. I want you to sacrifice him to me. And that's the moment when Abraham really means, oh man, God, you mean everything. Now God stops him. He says, okay, don't actually sacrifice your son. But He makes this really important point, and He creates this really important understanding with His relationship with Abraham and with us, that when He calls us to worship Him, that we need to bring Him everything because He is worthy of everything. This is what worship looks like. We see this all throughout the Old Testament, and then we see this in the New Testament. Jesus begins calling His disciples. He says, I want you to follow me. I want you to follow me and become my disciple. I'm going to teach you what it means to worship God. I'm going to teach you what it means to be a Christian. And the disciples begin asking questions. Well, what does it mean to really follow you? And Jesus explains this in Matthew chapter 16. He says this, then Jesus told His disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Hopefully you've been going to church long enough and you've read enough of your Bible to understand this idea that God is worthy of everything. That when we worship, we're called to sacrifice everything in His name. Our thoughts, our energy, our future, our hopes, and our dreams, all of it belongs to God. Now, this is the reality of what it means to be a Christian, but it's hard because we know, I know I need to give God everything. But sometimes I struggle just to give God something. Sometimes it gets to the end of the day and it's like, oh man, I haven't really read my Bible today, but it's 11 o'clock and I'm tired. We know cognitively, we have this understanding that God is worthy of everything, but we don't always live that out. Now, if you're a brand new Christian or if you've been a Christian for a long time, the same is true for each of us. We all know that we probably should be reading our Bibles more. We probably should be praying more. We probably should be giving God more of ourselves, but we all fall short. We have this image of what it looks like to be a Christian, giving God everything, and yet there's some days when we don't measure up to that image. There's some days where we struggle to have the motivation to even want to live that way. Where is the disconnect? We know God is worthy of everything, of all of our time, our energy, our efforts, our finances. God is worthy of it all. And yet we don't always live that way. We struggle to meet that reality when it comes to being a Christian. Where's the disconnect? I want to look at this principle. There's this guy named Simon Sinek. I don't know if you're familiar with this stuff. He's not really big. He's not. I don't know if he's a Christian or if he's religious at all. Most of his stuff is focused on the business world, the corporate sector, and leadership and stuff like that. But I found his stuff a long time ago through a TED Talk. He has this really famous TED Talk, and then after that, he's written a number of books. I think he consults professionally for big corporations. But he's got some really cool stuff when it comes to business, and I think a lot of it, though, applies to faith. But I want to explain this thing he calls the golden circle. And so he has this chart that has what, how, and why. And I don't know if you can see this. Here's his little golden circle. He has a whole book. We're not going to cover it as extensively as it would help, but just for the sake of today, let me explain this for you. So his argument is that everyone, when they approach their job, so let's take your job, what you do for a living, everyone has a bigger understanding of what they do. Like, that's where they focus, that's where they start. Most people start there. It's the most concrete part of the golden circle, and so most people, they focus on what they do. And so you have a job, and you probably have a job description that defines what you do. You probably have a spec sheet written out of what it is that you sell or the services that you offer. What you do and what you offer is probably very well defined, very easy for you to articulate, very easy for you and other people to understand. And then when it comes to how you do it, there's less written down, there's less articulated, but this is like best practices, standard operating procedure. How you do what you do is also, there's a lot of energy and effort that goes into understanding what that is. But then when we get to why, he points out that many people don't know why they do what they do. And he says that oftentimes people will just default to, well, I get paid to do it. So when it comes to your job, you know well what you do, or at least you should. You know how you do it, but do you know why you do it? Why do you do what you do? He says that the most successful people, they don't start with what and develop what the most. They actually start with why. He says the people who are most successful at what they do, they begin with the why, and they have the most concrete understanding of why it is they do what they do. I want to give you an example. About 10 years ago, I started working at Chick-fil-A. And it was kind of my job in college. And there was a group of us who went into this group interview to work at Chick-fil-A. And in the group interview, there were like 10 of us in there. They kind of asked us, where do you see yourself in 10 years? And kind of a silly question to ask a group of people who were working at Chick-fil-A. But one of the guys, his name was Corey. Corey, and he said, I would like to own this Chick-fil-A in 10 years. And I just rolled my eyes. We all did. Like, what a crazy thing to say in an interview. But it turns out, so he got hired. A group of us from that interview got hired, and it turns out he was authentic in that aspiration, in that dream. He really did want to be an owner and an operator of Chick-fil-A. Now, when we started working at this Chick-fil-A, we all got trained, and we all had the same job. We all had the same what. When we talk about what, how, and why, we all shared the exact same what. We all had the same job description. We all had the same level of excellence that was expected from each of us. Every time a customer says thank you, what are we supposed to say at Chick-fil-A? My pleasure. You guys have eaten there before. And every time that someone comes up to the drive-thru, you're supposed to smile. I don't know if you know this, but when you're sitting at the drive-thru window in your car, it is expected that the person working at the window is talking to you the entire time. So even if you're waiting on food, it was my job at the window to just stand there and just make small talk. And it's the worst, because you don't want to talk to me, right? You just want your food. I don't really want to talk to you, but I have to make this forced small talk, and it's car after car. It's the worst. And there were times when you're just not feeling it, and so you'd be like, I'm not going to talk to this person right now. There's 5 minutes before this chicken sandwich is done. I'm not going to talk to you for 5 minutes. I don't know you. I'm never going to see you again. And so I would go and I would just count sauce packets, acting like I was doing something important. But this guy, Corey, he wouldn't. Corey, he knew what his job was, the same as the rest of us, but he understood why he was doing it. Every single day he showed up to work, he had a goal. He wanted to get as much understanding of how Chick-fil-A worked. He wanted to have as much understanding of why these principles were taught to employees, because one day he was going to own a Chick-fil-A. So when he had to make small talk for 30 customers in a row, he did it. When he had to say my pleasure, even though he was having a terrible day, he said it. He met the level of excellence that was expected when the rest of us, sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. We all shared the same what, but we didn't all share the same why. His why motivated him to meet the standard of excellence that was set forth for him. The rest of us, our why was basically just money, which isn't a real why, because we can make money working anywhere else. Our why when it came to working at Chick-fil-A was, well, it's just a job. But his why was different, and it drove him to do the what better. And I bring this up because this applies to our faith. We all share the same what, and that what is to worship God with everything. But we all struggle to meet the level of excellence that God expects from us. We don't always hit it. But those of us who are going to hit it more often than not are going to be those of us who have a clear understanding of why it is that we are called to worship God with everything, because the why is what drives the what. Now, some people, if you ask them, why are you a Christian? Why do you worship God? Very similar to the people working at Chick-fil-A who say, it's just for the paycheck. Some people will say, well, I don't want to go to hell. And that's not the kind of motivation that's going to push us to live the way God expects. That's kind of just the bare minimum. When that is our why, if you are only worshiping God so that you can not go to hell when you die, you're going to go to church maybe if you feel like it. You're going to praise God during the singing if you're in the mood for it. You're going to give God your attention. You're going to read if you have time. But it's kind of going to be the bare minimum. Having a clear understanding, a true understanding of why it is that we worship God will motivate us and push us to really give Him everything that He's due. And this isn't just for His sake, by the way. This is also for our benefit too. The more that we give to God, you cannot outgive God. And there's something beautiful as we deepen our relationship with God to see what He does as a result in our life. And so this psalm kind of reflects the importance of why. It has the first two lines, the first two verses of the psalm that explain what. They say, what is expected of you? It is worship. But then the rest of the psalm gets into why. And so I want to read that. I want to read why the psalm says we should worship God. And so if you turn to verse 3, it says this: when we were overwhelmed by sins, you forgave our transgressions. Blessed are those you choose to bring near to live in your courts. We are filled with the good things of your house, of your holy temple. Forgiveness, election, and blessing. These are the three reasons that are given to us in this psalm. Now, there's more reasons to worship God than that. But these are the ones that we see in this psalm: forgiveness, election, and blessing. So we're going to get into what those three things mean, and how those can kind of motivate us and encourage us to sacrifice everything for God. But before we do that, I want to finish the psalm. There's not a lot left, and so it'll be a pretty quick read. But if you would turn and continue with me, we're going to start here in verse 5. And it says this: you answer us with awesome and righteous deeds, God our Savior, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, who formed the mountains by your power, having armed yourself with strength, who stilled the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, and the turmoil of the nations. The whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders. Where morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. We're presented with a God who moves mountains. We're presented with a God who calms storms in that passage right there. And the response of all the earth, it says at the end, the whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders. Where morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. Worship is the natural response when the earth encounters God's strength. As God moves mountains, as God calms storms, the world is in awe of His work and responds in praise. As I was reading this particular part, I was thinking about storms that I had been. I was trying to think of like the craziest storm that I had ever been in. And there was one time I was up in Mount Arrowhead, and I was up on the mountain right up here, right up there, and while I was up there was this big thunderstorm. And I was on a hike, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to stay on this hike during this thunderstorm because that's going to be a really cool experience. It was raining really hard, and it was windy, and we don't get like crazy storms here, and so there was no like danger, right? It didn't sound very dangerous. At least I didn't think it was very dangerous. And so I decided I'm going to keep on going in this hike because I want to experience like the power of this storm. And it was really cool. Like the wind was whipping through the trees, and then there was like you could hear distant lightning, but then the lightning kind of got closer and closer and closer. And I had never been, I feel like all the storms up until that point in my life, every like thunderstorm I'd ever been around was like far away. And thunder and lightning is really cool. Like when you can like see the flash, and then a few seconds later you hear the thunder, it's kind of like this cool thing. It's much less cool when it just happens, like right on top of you. And like literally there was lightning cracking like all around, and there were lots of trees, so I think I was safe. I don't know. But it didn't feel safe, and it was so loud. Have you ever been in a thunderstorm before? Have you ever had lightning crack around you? That feeling, it was unreal. So like the rain is very loud, the wind is very loud, and the lightning, like all of it combining together is a crazy experience. I have never in my life experienced so much like raw power. It was like my heart was beating, like I was alive. I've been chasing that high ever since. Like that was crazy. But I remember as I was reading this, I was kind of thinking back on that. And I imagined, what would it be like? What would it be like in the midst of that power that was on display? And I was feeling it. It was like visceral, like my hair was all static. I was feeling the power. What would it be like for God to step in and silence it in a moment? And I picture myself just kind of standing in the forest and then everything just stopping. And I got goosebumps because that's the power of God. And Jesus does this at one point in the New Testament. He goes with the disciples, and they're out in the middle of a storm. And I can picture it. And then Jesus says, stop, and it stops, and the sea gets quiet. That's the power of the God we worship. A God who can move mountains, who formed the mountains with his hands. A God who can take a storm, so much power and strength, and just stop it, and then silence. All of a sudden, our problems, they become a lot smaller. All of a sudden, the things that we're wrestling with, God, is it ever possible to fix this? All of a sudden, it's like, yeah, I think God can do something about that. God's strength is on display in this passage here. We see his strength. The earth encounters his strength, and then the earth responds with worship. And the earth is not forcing itself to worship. The peoples are not forcing themselves to worship. They're compelled to. They can't help but respond in worship as they encounter God's strength. The passage continues, and it says this in verse 9. You care for the land and water it. You enrich it abundantly. The streams of God are filled with water to provide the people with grain. For so you have ordained it. You drench its furrows and level its ridges. You soften it with showers and bless its crops. You crown the year with bounty, and your carts overflow with abundance. The grasslands of the wilderness overflow. The hills are clothed with gladness. And then here's the response. The meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing. So once again, another quality of God is on display. The goodness of God is being encountered by all creation. And as creation encounters God's goodness, what is the response of creation? It is worship. And again, we don't see creation trying hard to meet this image and this expectation of giving everything to God. No, it just happens. All of creation encounters God's goodness and God's blessing, and it can't help but respond with worship, authentic and true worship. As God's strength is on display, and as God's goodness is on display, creation responds each time in worship. And I love the way that this passage, Psalm 65, is laid out. Because you have that first part, verses 5 through 8. And in 5 through 8, it's the strength of God. God moving mountains, God calming storms. And with the strength of God on display, in 5 through 8, the response is praise. And then the final chunk in 9 through 13, it's the goodness of God as God blesses all of the earth. And we have imagery of rain and grass on a hillside. And this is a big deal because this audience that was receiving this at the time, they were very agrarian, very agricultural. So it was all about, their livestock and their crops. So the idea of God bringing rain is really God bringing wealth. Because the more that it rains, the more the crops, the better they do, and the more grass for their sheep to eat, sheepses, whatever they are. I'm not a farmer. But this idea of God's rain and God's blessing and God's goodness providing, and I love what it says in there. It says, you drench its furrows and level its ridges. In 11, you crown the year with bounty and your carts overflow with abundance. The grasslands of the wilderness, they overflow. So it's not just God providing the bare minimum, saying, I'm going to give you enough for dinner tonight. It's saying, no, God, I'm going to give you more than that. God is saying, I'm going to bless you with abundance. Your cup will overflow. We have this image of a good God who blesses us. And the response in that passage, again, is the same. The earth responds in praise. So as we encounter God's strength and as we encounter God's goodness, more thoroughly, and as we get a better understanding of that, praise will more naturally be our response. And I see it this way. We talked about those three words, forgiveness, election, and blessing. I see it represented in these passages. That first part when it talks about the strength of God. I think one of the greatest acts of strength is forgiveness. Especially when you're forgiving someone who is actively hurting you. I don't know if there's anything that requires more strength than forgiving someone who is actively hurting you, and beyond that, actively hurting someone you love. But that is the life of Jesus. That is what God did. God looked at a sinful creation, a creation that continued to murder the prophets that he sent. And God knew that if he sends his son, they will also murder his son. But God said, this is what it takes to forgive them, and so this is what I'm going to do. And he sends his son. And then Jesus, being mocked and ridiculed and humiliated and tortured, he looks at the people hurting him, and what does he say? You remember that line? He says, forgive them, Father, they know not what they're doing. That is strength. It's one thing to defeat an army. It's one thing to move mountains, but this is a different kind of strength. I think this is the ultimate act of strength, to forgive. That's hard. But as we encounter God's strength, especially in his forgiveness, worship will result. And then there's God's goodness. As we encounter God's goodness, as he chooses us and we more fully understand what that means, and as he blesses us, as we more fully encounter the richness of his blessings, the more praise will result. I remember as a kid going to the doctor, and one of the things they always used to do is they'd hit your knee with that hammer. You remember when the doctor would do that? They get their little mini hammer thing, and they'd hit your knee, and they're checking your reflex. I remember I always used to fight it as a kid. I was like, you can't make me do that, and I'd always fight it. And the doctor's just trying to make sure I'm not dying, but I felt the need to not kick. And it's a compulsory response, right? It's a reflex. You can't help, if you're relaxed, you can't help but kick your knee. And I see that in this passage. As we more fully encounter the goodness of God, as we more fully encounter the strength of God, we won't help but respond in worship. It'll be compulsory. It'll just happen. But this happens as we more fully understand why. A lot of us as Christians, we focus on what it means to be a Christian. We take our Bibles and we say, this is what it looks like to be a Christian. I need to make sure I read my Bible. I need to make sure I pray. I need to make sure I go to church. I need to try not to cuss. I need to try not to lust. I need to try not to be greedy. This is what it looks like to be a Christian. But the more we encounter why we are called to be Christians, why we are called to worship, the more naturally this will come. If we just focus on trying to meet this picture of being a perfect Christian, it's going to be hard. You're going to struggle. But if we focus on why we believe, if we focus on God's forgiveness, his goodness, his choosing of us and his blessings, we won't have to try very hard to be this image of what we know we should be. It's just going to happen more naturally. And so I want to get into forgiveness, election, and blessing really quick as we close. So for forgiveness, Romans 3:23 says this, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." We are all sinners. We've all made mistakes. Now, sometimes we might look back at our life before Jesus fondly. Some of you might say, those were fun times. I enjoyed the life I was living. Sometimes we don't fully come to grips with how dangerous sin is. Sometimes we don't fully understand how bad things could have been if we would have stayed in our sin. Sin will ruin everything. If we allow sin in our lives, it will destroy your marriage. It will destroy your relationship with your kids. It will destroy your health. If we allow sin in our lives, it will kill every part of our life, and eventually it will kill us. Sin is dangerous and sin is deadly, and God saved us from that. God gave us an opportunity to be forgiven of our sin, and then even more than that, to step out of our sin. And with that, God saved us. And the more we encounter that, the more we understand what exactly God saved us from, the more naturally we will want to worship Him. There was one time I was getting my master's degree, and I accidentally plagiarized. I know how that sounds, but it was actually an accident. I had this quote from a book, and I put it in my essay, and I forgot to cite the source. I had the quotations and everything in there, so it was clear that I was trying to put a quote there, but I just never put the footnote. And I'd never done that before. I didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal. I didn't know I was doing it, but I got flagged. There's this software that flags plagiarism. And it flagged me. And I was like, oh, bummer, I'm going to have to explain that to the teacher. And it was like an auto-fail. They have a no forgiveness policy. And so I was like, oh, I better email my teacher and let them know, hey, this is what happened. So I emailed the teacher, and this is my final paper. And the teacher says, sorry, you did plagiarize according to the rules, and you're going to fail your final. And that means I'm going to fail the whole class. Now, this is scary at this point for me because I'm like, this is like a master's degree. It's one thing to flunk a class in high school, but I'm kind of like an adult now. I can't be failing classes. And I'm like, what is this going to look like at work? I need to extend another semester. Just take one class. It's going to be expensive. So I'm stressing. And they did have me dead to rights because according to the rules, I am responsible to cite my sources. Even if you forget, it's still plagiarizing. So now I'm really stressed. The fact that they're not playing ball with me, I'm nervous. I'm financially and everything. This is gonna be bad. And I remember going into the office of my professor, and he's like, well, let's game plan how you're going to recover from this. I'm like, oh, this is terrible. And partway through the conversation, he says, you know what? We're going to let this one slide. And I think he was going to do that the whole time. He was kind of being a jerk about it. But I remember in that moment of him forgiving me, I actually got up and I hugged him. It was so unprofessional. But I felt so much joy in the fact that he gave me a second chance. And especially after seeing what was on the line, seeing what was going to change. When I encountered that forgiveness, I couldn't help but respond. I hugged him. I could have hugged him longer. I felt so much joy. And it's the same when it comes to God. The more we understand what He has saved us from, the consequences that sin would have done in our lives. If we understand that our marriage don't stand a chance unless God's forgiveness and grace enter into our lives. If our ability to parent our kids well, it doesn't stand a chance unless God's grace and forgiveness enters our lives. The more we understand that, the more that praise will naturally flow out of us. And then election. Ephesians 1:4 says this, for He chose us in Him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in His sight. In love, He predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ. God chose you. You're sitting here today because at some point, God chose you and made that calling clear to you. You've been elected by God. Now, there's a lot of people out there, but God chose you. He says, I want to have a relationship with you. I want to save you. And the more that we can understand that, the more naturally worship will flow out of us. The more willing we will be to give God everything, the more we will want to worship Him. If we can understand that God chose us, each of us individually, there's something really special about that. My wife comes from a family that is very non-Christian. In fact, many of them are hostile to God. And you can see it reflected in the older generation of her family, all the parents and their brothers and sisters. And you see kind of this lifestyle being passed down to the kids. And you see the effects of sin passing down her family. And I see election so clearly in her story because there was really no reason why she should have started showing interest in church. It wasn't taught to her by her parents. It wasn't taught to her by her siblings. It wasn't taught to her by her school. She can't even articulate what it was that drew her into church. It just happened. But when she looks back on her life, when I look at where she started and the family she was in and the trajectory that all the siblings had, God chose her and took her out of that. While the rest of her family kind of continues in these cycles of sin and brokenness and fractured relationship, God picked her and said, no, I'm choosing you. I'm saving you from that. And when I look at her story, I see so clearly a definition of being chosen by God. And the more that we can understand that we have been chosen by God, the more naturally we will worship. And the last one is God's blessing, God's provision. And for this, I'm just going to read Psalm 23. We're short on time. I'm sorry, I went over today. So I'm going to just read Psalm 23. So if you would stand, I'm going to invite the team up. We're going to close with this. I want you to stand, and I want you to just receive this psalm. I want you to close your eyes, and I'm going to read this psalm over you, and I want you to focus on the provision and the blessing of God in your life, the good things that God has given you, the bad things He's protected you from. So I'm going to read this. Psalm 23 says this, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for His name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for You are with me. Your rod and Your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely Your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever."